Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the panel as well for helping to drill down into what we can do, what is reasonable, what isn't reasonable. And Dame Sara, I hope that you'll be able to help the committee further by perhaps giving us a note on the kind of mechanism that you described that could be done either via legislation or perhaps standalone, to give people like, for instance, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York, who not normally regarded as extreme in their views, but their statement last week about their concerns about freedom of religion or belief, I think are reasonable concerns, and others have pointed out, and as Ruth mentioned earlier on as well, that judicial review is a cumbersome, costly, timely process. So this idea that you put to us about having independent oversight, some way of ensuring that the right balance is struck and we achieve the objectives that you've so eloquently outlined. Perhaps if you could let us have more on that, because I personally would like to see it. But if I can take you back now to the prevent strategy for a moment. I mean, some of us feel we've been here before, first with the Labour government that introduced it, but then the coalition government in 2011, and genuine attempts to try and tackle some forms of the worst kinds of extremism. I was struck by Sir William Shawcross's review from 2023, and I wondered if you could tell us really whether this new definition is going to tackle some of the things that he identified in his recommendations and conclusions. I mean, for instance, he said it should return to its overarching objective of stopping individuals becoming terrorists or supporters. He pointed to what he called a double standard. He talked about the funding of groups that promoted extremist narratives, some, he said, including those who are sympathetic to the Taliban. He said there's a lack of training and a concerted campaign by some, including Islamist groups, to undermine and delegitimize Prevent. So how far have we travelled in dealing with his concerns? What improvements have been made between Prevent and what the government have now come forward with?
Is this for me, or is
well, for all three of you, really. But Dame Sara, why don't you kick off?
Okay, so I mean, just on the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man who I deeply respect, actually. I mean, interestingly, he completely endorsed my 2021 report. So he agreed with the idea that we should have a legal framework for hateful extremism, as did the Chief Rabbi, as did Kari Asim, who was the chair of the Mosques and Imams National Advisory Board. So the idea that, you know, the Archbishop and other faith leaders actually supported a legal framework, yet the Archbishop has come out against this, I think is a very interesting situation. Just as a side note, on the issue of Prevent and what William Shawcross wrote, he was right to talk about counter-extremism. I think he obviously looked at it through the lens of when extremism leads to terrorism. The harms of extremism are incredibly broad. You know, extremism can lead to terrorism, it can lead to genocide and ethnic cleansing at the very worst, but it can also undermine social cohesion, it can undermine the democratic rights and freedoms of other people, and that's just something to bear in mind. I mean, I think he is right. I think some of what this definition will do will address some of those concerns that he raised about making sure funding is not given, and rightly so. Taxpayers' money should not be given to those who are legitimising extremist narratives, organisations and others. I think that's absolutely right. So I think some of that will be dealt with. What I don't understand is how far this definition will influence Prevent as an operational strategy. That's something that's not clear. I suppose that's a question for the government really to answer, because I don't have the answer to that question.
That's helpful, thank you. Joshua?
Well, Michael Gove did say that most extremist materials and activities are not illegal and don't meet the terrorism or the national security threshold, but extremism could lead to terrorism. So obviously Prevent, which deals with terrorism, is connected with what we're talking about now, which is extremism. He was very critical, as you recall, William Shawcross, in his report on Prevent last year. Prevent is not doing enough to counter non-violent Islamist extremism. Challenging extremist ideology should not be limited to proscribed organisations, but should also cover domestic extremists operating below the terrorism threshold who can create an environment conducive to terrorism. He was very critical of the focus of Prevent. It's out of kilter with the rest of the counter-terrorism system. He points out that Islamist extremism, in his view, represents a primary terrorist threat to this country, but 80% of the counter-terrorism police network's live investigations were Islamist, but only 22% of Prevent referrals concerned Islamism, and that suggested a loss of focus and a failure to identify warning signs. So there's clearly a problem in his view with Prevent, and this is only last year that he reported. But I think, again, you know, if you're talking about extremism, you're talking perhaps even as a sort of pre-crime, a crime, it's not a crime at all, but it leads to the crime of terrorism. And I do think it's important to keep the two apart, but I do think that Prevent has a lot to answer for, certainly Shawcross does.
Thank you very much. What about you, Ruth?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think echoing what's been said by the panel already, we're not yet clear how the new definition will impact the Prevent strategy from 2011, but obviously it's unclear how you could kind of replace the statutory definition with a non-statutory definition. Our Liberty's view is obviously that this new definition is still very broad, and we fear that it will continue to compound the existing harms of the Prevent duty, which has a particular impact on the rights to freedom of expression, assembly, thought and conscience, and religion, particularly of Muslims, children and people who are neurodivergent. I would also just add, because the panel has mentioned the sort of idea that the conveyor belt theory, where people are presumed to move from having an extremist ideology to then taking part in or engaging in terrorist activity, and just wanted to touch on that. This is a theory that has been widely discredited, actually, including by the JCHR itself in 2016, who pointed out that religious conservatism by no means correlates with support for violent jihadism. The British government itself, there were documents leaked in 2010 that revealed a clear assessment that people do not progress through non-violent extremism to violent groups. And so I just think, as an organisation, Liberty has a fundamental problem with the Prevent strategy. We think it needs an independent review, and we think this is a good opportunity to have some of those conversations.
It's interesting to me as well, looking back at what Sir William wrote, that there were some softer points as well. I mentioned one of them, the training of people, but he also referred to it being used really to help people who have mental health problems, who he said, in fact, I'll quote it exactly, he said that Prevent is carrying the weight for mental health services, with vulnerable people being referred when they're in need of other forms of support. So, I mean, the cross-government, cross-departmental themes here. I mean, is this new definition taking into account things like that? They're softer questions, I know, but they do have a relevance, I think.
Michael Gove certainly said that he has consulted with the Home Office, but you've got the Home Office responsible for counter-terrorism, Prevent and so on. You've got the Levelling Up and Communities Department responsible for extremism, because I presume it's the Communities Department that funds the organisations which now stand to lose their funding. But it does seem strange that you've got separate departments dealing with two aspects of the same problem.
Joshua, would you include in that this lack of training and also a lack of confidence in sometimes dealing with some of the extremist organisations, because people have not been prepared or have the knowledge to know how to deal with people?
There are certainly problems about training. I mean, what Shawcross said was that Prevent takes an expansive approach to the extreme right wing, capturing a variety of influences that at times have been so broad it's included mildly controversial or provocative forms of mainstream right-wing leaning commentary that have no meaningful connection to terrorism or radicalisation. And if you'll forgive me, I'll quote an example that Shawcross, quotes in a footnote. I think this is meant to refer to right-wing leaning commentary. He refers to Rod Liddell, Douglas Murray and Melanie Phillips, who happens to be my wife.
Yes, I understand. Thank you very much indeed. But I think Sara wants